be delivered by Professor Neilesh Bose, who is Associate Professor and Canada Research Chair of History, University of Victoria, Canada. And we are privileged to have with us today Professor Suranjan Dash, who is the Honorable Vice Chancellor of Adams University and who is also an eminent historian himself. We are also happy to have with us Professor Shukanto Choudhury, a very eminent academic, and Professor Shumit Chakraborty of Presidency University, and we welcome all of you in today's program. May I now request Thank you. Today's program was also supposed to be graced by the presence of our Honorable Education Minister, Sri Bratya Basu, but because of an emergency work at the State Legislative Assembly, Vidhan Sabha, we regret to say that he will be perhaps delayed to arrive, but he has asked and requested us to move ahead with the program in time. So before we go on and move to the academic session, I first request the Director of the Institute of Language Studies and Research, Dr. Shastri, to formally greet the speakers today. Thank you. It is time for the Director of the Institute of Language Studies and Research, Kolkata, Dr. Shastri, to say a few words in terms of welcome note. Dr. Guha.
Good afternoon to everyone. We welcome and thank Honorable Minister in charge of Departments of School and Higher Education, Government of West Bengal, and Honorable Chairperson, Institute of Language Studies and Research, Professor Bratya Basu. Sir will reach to later because you also know that he is busy in assembly work. Our distinguished speaker today, Professor Neilesh Bose of Victoria University, Canada, and eminent historian, Professor Suranjan Dash, who is the Honorable Vice Chancellor of Adams University. And with us, we have our Professor Anindya Shekhar Purokash already announced that Professor Shukanto Choudhury and Professor Shumit Choudhury, Professor Sucharita Bandyopadhyay, Professor other Salim Malik and other dignitaries are there. We also welcome and we are grateful to them, have them as they have come all the way to Canada, to Kolkata in their tour of cultural research, and we are privileged to host him today here for a research and academic dialogue. We once again extend our warm greetings to everyone in the audience. The Institute of Language Studies and Research, ILSR Kolkata, is a premier center for excellence disseminating advanced knowledge in language, linguistics, translation, and cultural studies. ILSR is affiliated to Department of Higher Education, Government of West Bengal. While pursuing the highest global academic standards, the Institute envisions itself as a facilitator of advanced research and employment by leveraging various opportunities offered by the emerging global knowledge and communication economy and cultural research. As a part of our ongoing research and future academic work, ILSR regularly organizes different academic events like invited talks, symposiums, research dialogues, as well as collaborative research, conversation, etc. Over the years, we have invited distinguished faculty members from different national and international institutes of repute, and we invited our distinguished speaker from the University of Victoria today in that spirit of academic excellence and knowledge transfer. We look forward to hear from you in more details in the course of the day. Our Haraprasad Shastri Memorial Lecture has previously been delivered by renowned academic and South Asian expert like Professor Brian Hatcher of Tufts University and Dr. Milindo Banerjee of University of St. Andrews. And today we are going to hear from Professor Neilesh Bose, who is very well-known scholar of South Asian studies. We sincerely hope that today's event will enlighten us and it will offer fresh insight on the subject of the talk of the day. We thank you all once again and we look forward to the academic proceedings now. Thank you.
A request to everyone to keep their mobile in the silent mode, if possible, because that would help the academic proceedings to move uninterrupted. That said, we move to the academic session today, which is the lecture by Professor Neilesh Bose. To introduce Neilesh Bose, he is currently Associate Professor of History and Canada Research Chair of Global and Comparative History at the University of Victoria. He has also served as a visiting professor at Ashoka University and Queen's College in New York City. Professor Bose's research interests include religion and secularism, the history of colonial India, the history of Bengal, and intellectual history. His book, Recasting the Region, Language, Culture, and Islam in Bengal, published by Oxford University Press in 2014, a very well-known book for all of us who are doing South Asian studies research. That book examines late colonial and early post-colonial histories of Bengali Muslim literary culture. Additionally, he holds interest in the history of migration as well as global history. In this area, his publications include a special edition in the Journal of World History and the edited volumes India After World History, Literature, Comparison and Approaches to Globalization, published by Leiden University Press, and also Monohar, this is the book. The other publications include South Asian Migrations in Global History, Labor, Law and Wayward Lives, published in 2020. So without further delay, I now hand it over to Professor Shubhanjan Das, who will be chairing this session of the 2023 Haraprasad Shastri Language, Literature, Cultural Histories Lecture Series of the Institute of Language Studies and Research. With that note, thank you, and over to Professor Shubhanjan Das. We will have the session in this way, that we'll have the talk and then we'll open it up for some questions and discussions. Thank you.
Professor Bose, esteemed members of the House, which includes my distinguished teacher, Professor Shukanta Chaudhary, friends, and of course I see some of my dear students also. Could I first say a very big thank you to the Institute and especially to Professor Shati Goa for enabling me to be here and attend this very interesting session. I'm sure it will be interesting because the problematic that has been chosen by Professor Bose is not only thought-provoking but it's also challenging. And we do look forward to a very fruitful session. As I see it, and Professor Bose may please correct me if I'm wrong, one way of looking at the phrase India after world history is unfolding of developments and processes in Indian history after crucial turning points in world history like the World Wars, Cold War, decolonization, the end of the Soviet era, and of course globalization. And if I may anticipate, Professor Bose in his lecture is likely to offer insights from history, literature, and globalization studies to unwind India's post-colonial trajectory and its contemporary position in the world, and we do look forward to having what will surely be a nuanced understanding of how global processes in a comparative perspective have shaped India's present realities and future aspirations. I hope I'm correct when I try to explicate the notion of India after its world history. And with these words, could I once again welcome Professor Bose amongst us, and could I please request this to make his submission. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to the hosts, Professors Guha, Bratya, to the Honorable Minister Basu, who is not able to be here with us, to distinguished professors who have given their time to serve in this session, including Professor Suranjan Dash, and to all of you. I am honored that you have given your time to this event, and I hope that my words may provoke reflection on topics such as world history, world literature, and the meaning of these two most central aspects of humanist research and writing today. So, as was mentioned, I will discuss aspects of my recent edited volume, India After World History, Literature, Comparison, and Approaches to Globalization. It was published in Leiden last year and in Delhi this year. And following this review of this book, I will introduce the book. I will explore the biography of one figure, Taraknath Dash, a globe-trotting anti-colonial revolutionary whose perspectives on the world, as well as his travels, I suggest offer paths toward new conceptions of world history, as well as material for those interested in probing world literature. So in this book, India After World History, scholars from both history and literary criticism, two of the largest, most venerated humanist disciplines, came together to offer reflections on the nature of world history as a subfield of history and world literature as a subfield of literary studies. And the book provides genealogies of the two subfields, as they have been called by B. Venkat Mani, the author of the afterword of the book, the quote, two most important arts that document our shared and unshared of our collective humanity. Of course, both subfields boast a range of critical interventions. I will briefly introduce the genealogies the book offers, as any critical understanding of them must flow from a full account of the origins of these subfields. Now, the first articulation of world literature as a concept, as well as the modern discipline of history as we know it, began in the 19th century. And though the term world literature is found in the work of many individuals, Wieland, Schlegel, Herder, but most focus on Goethe's 1827 mention to his disciple, Eckermann, that he was reading a Chinese novel and that, quote, national literature is now a rather unmeaning term. The epoch of world literature is at hand, and everyone must strive to hasten its approach. This is in 1827. And though the career of world literature as a concept began at that time, it found a different articulation just about 20 years later by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the Communist Manifesto of 1848. And here Marx and Engels do not specify a specific text or type of literature, but point to speed as well as the rise of the, quote, world market. And they discuss how in the place of local and immediate wants and products, intellectual production from that time onward will flow from material production that imagines the entire world as a system. As they say, quote, numerous national and local literatures will produce a world literature. Moving from awareness of literatures outside of one's own and the consciousness of a world market, the next and usual iteration of world literature in our time appears in the philologist Eric Auerbach's Philologie die Weltliteratur, 1952, which was an argument against an idealist conception of a world literature in the face of the age of decolonization, the welter of particularities and the welter of new nations after World War II. Now, other moments in the intellectual history of, quote, world literature, of course, may be found, but these three texts and these three moments, 1827, 1828, and 1952, these comprise the most referenced sites for opening a discussion of the topic. Now, in the contemporary age, in the 21st century, another group of three scholars, Pascal Casanova, Franco Moretti, and David Damrosch, have opened lively directions for the study of world literature in the current century. All of them imagine a world literary map with centers and peripheries, energized by metaphors and models drawn from other disciplines, economics, social sciences, biological sciences. Casanova offers an approach to the study of world literature through what is called a, quote, world republic of letters, in which different types of literature will meet via translation. Franco Moretti offers systems in the form of graphs and maps and trees and quantification as an approach to world literature, not a study of its content as such. Finally, Damrosch offers an update to these approaches and focuses on circulation, as he interprets world literature as, quote, all literary works that circulate beyond their culture of origin, either in translation or in their original language. The generative of a range of critical new directions in world literature scholarship, these three figures, so three of the 19th and three of the 20th, for first century, have instigated numerous directions and then also triggered intense critiques, some of which have been offered by some in this room, regarding the study of world literature from various angles. Now, if we move from literature to history, on the topic of world history, it is the 20th century, and figures like Arnold Toynbee and H.G. Wells, who inaugurated the first variant of world history in the English language. Informed by the world wars of the 20th century, these thinkers aimed to broadly synthesize all of human history for a general audience, and in the wake of war, unprecedented war, to advocate for peace by learning about this synthetic history. This was one of the first goals of world history. Later developments, late in the century, 20th century, were associated with the historian now departed Jerry Bentley and the World History Association of the United States of America, and they pioneered new research in areas such as comparative history, mass migration, and long-distance trade to be the subject of world history. And finally, in the late 20th century, the subfield observed a split between, quote, world and global histories. Today, there is a field called self-consciously global history. And this comprised a new agenda, focused on the specific history of globalization. It is not, therefore, a synthetic history, and it is not, therefore, a comparative history. And it imagines the world, again, as one unit. And this is a development of the 21st century. And it has manifested in numerous book series and journals with the title Global, as opposed to the title World. Now, one finding of this exercise that is discussed in this book is that the modern world is the world traditionally encountered by literary critics who imagine the world. Whereas world historians have debated conceptions of history that predate modern worlds, including non-modern and pre-modern worlds. Now, to address how historians and literary critics since these moments have approached the meeting points and the divergences of the fields in recent times. The contributions in the volume that I am speaking about offered three different paths to think about the need for history and literary studies to come together in the wake of globalization of our present. The first section features essays by literary critics such as Alex Beecroft and Jonathan Eric and Kailer Kulkarni, and all of them are invested in remaking literary criticism in a manner that would analyze the historical within any framework of literature. Alex Beecroft offers a series of reflections on the task of writing a global literary history, including historicizing the idea of world literature, which I have just briefly done, and offering that as a significant moment in the intellectual history of the complication of literature. Jonathan Eric, in a biographical register, who is an Anglophone literary critic trained in 19th century American literature, devoted an entire article to reading Sheldon Pollock's Languages of the Gods and the approaches that Pollock takes to language, power, and politics as potential models for new research in world literary study in the English language. It is probably the first and maybe the only reading of Sheldon Pollock by a 19th century Anglophone literary critic. Finally, Kailer Kulkarni studies 19th century Marathi Sahir poetry, and he calls it a, quote, re-gift to colonial Indologists. And it offers for him a view into, quote, worlding that may provide fodder for future research into 19th century global cultural history. The second thematic offered by this book is a focus on violence within both world historical and literary critical frameworks. One contribution, Nundini Dhor, offers an extended reading of the role of violence in plantation life in the indentured labor system, which followed after the abolition of transatlantic slavery as a way of understanding Amitabh Ghosh's Sea of Poppies. And she argues that a capitalist realism informs the characterization of various characters, as well as the time, as she calls it, the time of capital in the novel, necessitating historical attention to indentured labor, its actual details and contours that significantly diverge from transatlantic slavery, which it replaced. And she argues that this is essential for literary critics of our time. Radha Kumar approaches the discipline of history through both epistemic and literal violence in the study of riots in colonial India in 1899 and 1918 respectively, and argues that riots and the study of them would benefit from how literary critics and cultural studies critics understand events, critical events, which she claims that historians would do well to listen to. Finally, three historians, Jos Gomans, J. Daniel Elam, and Christopher Lee, approach the state of global history as a field by trying to bring literary critics and historians together. Gomans studies Neoplatonism in world history and claims it as a connective thread in Latin and Persian courts across much of the Eurasian world in the early modern period. And he argues that Neoplatonic variants of mysticism, like the philosopher King, they inform a shared political culture in the early modern world, whether under the Mughal Emperor Akbar or in Stuart England. And this connected culture for Gomans, he claims, has fallen out of view due to an academic preoccupation with modernity, and advocates world historians to focus on the pre-modern and the early modern. On the other end of the temporal spectrum, J. Daniel Elam examines what he terms, quote, radical presentism, or variants of 20th century anti-colonial thought, which deserve full examination in the framework of both literature and history, and aims to include anti-colonial thought in both. Finally, Christopher Lee, analyzes the exile writings of Alex Laguma, a notable anti-apartheid writer and activist. And rather than approach his fiction, He explores his nonfiction, his literary essays, his book reviews, his travel pieces, his political tracts, to resemble a study of what he calls distant writing, and argues that distant writing would be the next step for literary critics and historians to take up. And these contributions show consciousness of the debates about world literature and world history that are not chained to any one version of either paradigm. One issue with world history and world literature identified by almost all, and what is mentioned in this book, is the problem and the limit, the local and the vernacular. And this, of course, has been studied by many people, including some in this room. The one issue that those who would retain a focus on a world literary framework is the potential of world making, which is inherent in the concept of world literature. And this is argued by B. Venkatamani, the literary critic, who makes a plea for retaining a world literary framework. And in his piece, he contrasts the 1789 speech, one of the first speeches that mentions an analog of world history by Schiller, which is titled, "What is and to what end does one study universal history?" 1789. Though Mani mentions that it is imbued with the arrogance of emergent European imperial power, it also emphasizes the values one is intended to inculcate with what Schiller claimed a universal history. And in that universal history, he narrates the broader human history from what Schiller called savagery in quotes to so-called civilization, but emphasized again how synthesizing the fragments of the past into a coherent whole has pedagogic value, and it offers values for students. World history, according to Schiller, also acquires a scientific character through its synthesis. It requires synthesis, which aids in, quote, joining fragments together by imagining various links and transforming aggregates into a system. So in this piece that Mani offers, he contrasts this to Nehru's 1930 glimpses of world history, as we know here, letters to his daughter in jail, which also was intended to teach lessons, also had values, and also wanted to show how the world was connected, but imbued, of course, with interwar and anti-colonial sentiment. What remains for Mani and the value of both world literature and world history is an aspect of pedagogy and aesthetics that cannot be contained in any conception of local or literature or history. This is Mani's argument. He claims that, quote, aesthetic education through world literature and world history must take into account the political charge that the terms carry, and through which they define debates on human equality and dignity in the current time and for the future. The question is not whether we do engage in literatures or histories of nations or locals, or whether we do world history, but how we do it, and for which kind of public we imagine the study of history and the analysis of literature. And this is a comment on the title that he ends with, which also refers to a point made by Professor Dash in the introduction on the title. And Mani conducts an interpretation of the title and says that India after world history could mean that studying it at this time in history may place India after existing models of world history and world literature have exhausted their usefulness. We could think of India being approached after world history and world literature don't have any meaning for us. It also could mean a version of India after world history limits have been identified and various pedagogical values, aesthetics could be retained from a conception of the world that transcends the local. And that is how he ends his piece, which is the last piece of this book. And as he states in the last sentence of his piece, which is the last sentence of the book, is that India after world history that contemporary critics and historians investigate shall, quote, do away with exceptionalism and isolationism and be read to throw away shackles of narrow nationalism, majoritarian supremacy, and pedantic arrogance. And this is the last sentence of the book. Now, one way to think about this, there are of course many ways that one may focus a research agenda with that in mind, but one is to focus on migration in all of its forms, in all of its meanings, for both historical and literary reflection, as the site for writing and rewriting histories that attempt a world historical intervention. In another recent edited volume of South Asian Migrations in Global History, contributors centered migration in this kind of a query and focused on labor migrations, the importance of law in regulating migrants, and the biographies of individuals often left out of the official records. One issue that was mentioned in both books that is, in a way, the crux of thinking of India after world history is a focus of world making, or the making of certain worlds possible. And this is commonly understood through the philosopher Nelson Goodman's Ways of World Making, a work of philosophy which explores how social actors construct their own worlds, including composing, weighting, ordering, and supplementing available resources of culture, religion, and language. Most relevant to world history and world literature is the sort of world making done in the name of anti-colonial nationalisms, as recently studied by the political theorist Edom Getachew in her book, World Making After Empire. And in that book, she studies Black Atlantic intellectuals and political leaders, highlighting the, quote, project of overcoming international hierarchy and constituting a post-imperial world. This itself may be a form of world history. So one such person that I'm also studying, about which a biography is forthcoming by me, is Taraknath Dash, a prime case for New World histories, as well as reflection by those concerned with world literature, offering materials for life writing at the edges of empires as well as the edges of nation states. He was an itinerant nationalist and anti-colonial activist of the early 20th century, spent considerable time in the United States and Canada and various other countries, and remains a relatively understudied figure in local histories, whether of the United States, whether of India, or any other kind of formation. His movements, his many writings, and he wrote a great deal, serve as a window into entangled histories between the United States of America and colonial India in the late colonial era. And like other, quote, expatriate patriots, such as Mohandas Gandhi, Shyamji Krishna Varma, and various others, he is a central figure in the history of overseas nationalism in the early to mid 20th century. He was born in 1884 in Western Bengal, north of Calcutta, and reared in the actively nationalist milieu of his generation. And he traveled abroad to Japan in 1905 as he aimed to gain both education and anti-colonial training like many of his contemporaries. In 1906, he crossed the Pacific Ocean from Japan and entered North America via Seattle. And he worked on railroads and various odd jobs, and then moved to San Francisco a few years later. And from a Northern Californian base, he found in Washington and Oregon a burgeoning community of Indian laborers working in lumber and shingle mills, small-scale agriculture, celery farms, and various seasonal labor, where he would primarily encounter Punjabi Sikh laborers in contexts like those pictured here. This is taken from 1914. And these are issues that he had no idea about until he got to these places. In 1907, he got a job as a laboratory helper in Berkeley and darted between there and a growing community in British Columbia. Witnessed and wrote about 2 riots in September of 1907, including the Vancouver riots against Asians, where riots and sources of violence against Asian groups had been occurring since the 1890s. And there, in 1907, Dash begins the Hindustani Association, and he was interviewed by the Daily Province of Vancouver. And he mentions that his goal was to look after the immigration rights of Hindus in America, in 1907. He also wrote about the 1907 Bellingham riots in Washington state, the first visible moment of organized expulsion aimed at South Asians, and began to deliver a cross-border system of support and information gathering between British Columbia and Canada, Washington, Oregon, and California. And part of his access to this burgeoning world of surveillance was his work for the Immigration Service in Vancouver, July 1907 to the spring of 1908. And at that time, he started this periodical, The Free Hindustan, a mouthpiece of a growing anti-colonial movement in North America. The first edition included long pieces about famine in India, designating causes in British policy, also articles about Indian religion, Indian history, as well as European history and European highlights of the modern world. By 1909, the paper appeared alongside many other periodicals, Swadesh Sevak, The Aryan, and many others in BC, Washington, Oregon, and South Africa. In the fall of 1908, Dash left the Northwest to attend Norwich University, pictured there on the right, the other end of the continent, in Vermont, a military training academy. Suspended in 1909 because of his advocacy of war against their ally, the British Empire, he returned to Seattle and earned a BA Political Science. In 1910, he worked with laborers in Berkeley and earned an MA in 1911. And he also served as an interpreter from Hindi and Punjabi in the St. John's trial in the spring of 1910, in which a few individuals and members of the police implicated many Indian laborers in an attack on white people in Oregon. So by 1913, he is definitively a part of the historical record. In 1913, along with the newly arrived Haraprasad and many others, Santokh Singh, Sohan Singh Bucknell, he started the Pacific Coast Hindustan Association, later known as the Govt Party. It saw a rise of infiltration from a new surveillance network led by one Hopkinson and his associates in San Francisco, Oregon, Washington, California, and various other parts of the world. Dash was declared an anarchist by the US authorities and by the British authorities. Despite this, he received citizenship in the United States in 1914, that same year that is so important for world history. And as a newly naturalized US citizen, he traveled to Canada to help those trapped in the Komagata Maru, the ship that was held immobile in Vancouver's port since May of that year, which was due to recently passed legislation that only admitted immigrants who entered on a continuous journey from their point of origin, making it impossible for Indians to enter Canada. In 1914, the United States convened many hearings on bills aimed at restricting the immigration of, quote, Hindus, this is how they were referred, and only visible in recent years to the US and Canadian authorities, there was a new consciousness of so-called Hindus as anarchists and radicals, and this predated in the 1917 Immigration Act, which created a barred zone, including all of Asia, and that Indians were included in this zone and were not able to enter the United States. They were tied in the combined US and Canadian imagination to both labor and insurgency. After leaving the US as a citizen in 1914, Dash spent 3 years in various points northwest, as well as in Europe. And in the spring of 17, he and 42 others, Govtites and Germans and many others, were tried on sedition and allegations of conspiracy. And this referred to a series of planned revolutionary uprisings, 1914 to 1917. This was called, in the US press, the Hindu-German conspiracy trial. And Dash was a key figure in this trial. The trial lasted about a year, cost 450,000 US dollars, included 150 witnesses who were summoned to testify against the Indian and German alleged conspirators. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, found Dash guilty, along with 28 others. He was imprisoned in Leavenworth Prison in Kansas in 1918 for a year, alongside anarchists of various types, labor leaders, Germans who were sympathetic to Indian independence, and radicals the world over. In June of 1918, he entered the prison in Leavenworth, Kansas, the first Indian migrant to do so, as inmate 12489 in leg irons and handcuffs. And at that time in prison, the population swelled to include all sorts of people: German immigrants of various types, Mexican revolutionaries, socialists, anarchists, IWW members, the International Workers' Party, approximately 400 others who were seen as foreigners to the US. He served his time until October of 1919, was based in the East Coast of the United States, and then in New York and Germany in the interwar period. He married Mary Keating Morse, who was classified as a white person, who worked for and was one of the founding members of the NAACP. And because of that, his citizenship was under scrutiny. Another point about his life that I can speak about if there's interest. Now, like his counterpart, Shyamji Krishna Varman, Dash wrote a great deal, and he spent time in a whole variety of places in the context of an anti-colonial set of networks. Interestingly, though, he posed the United States as a role model for a future federated India, and he wrote about this in a variety of spaces, as well as the idea of the US as an inspiration. Dash's Is Japan a Menace to Asia was published in 1917. It was cited as evidence in the Hindu-German conspiracy trial, as evidence of his conspiracy, in which he wrote and agitated against the British Empire because he supported the rise of the Japanese Empire. As a reflection of his early training in politics and formal political science at the University of Washington and his Indian nationalism, he argued that Japan's rise to power was not a menace to Asia, but it was rather a force for containing European aggression. And he goes into great detail about this kind of argument, though it was written from the United States, which is another interesting part of this. And it was written from the explicit point of view of an insider in the global color line of his moment. And he mentioned how Japan's rise was a check to, quote, white men's countries in Australia, Canada, and South Africa. By 1917, Dash had lived this kind of experience in white settler colonies like Canada and like the United States. A focus on Asia preceded his book, India and World Politics. This is pictured there on the right. A work that upheld the model of the United States of America as an exemplary Republican form. This is something that he also wrote about in depth. It emerged out of his time in jail from March 1918 to June 1919. 15 chapters. It offers a reader a sense of the world from India's perspective within what he called a world system. It covers India's role in the British Empire, India's relationships to Central Asia, etc. It is a consideration of the future of India as a world power. It came out approximately 15 years after the appearance of Mohandas Gandhi's Hind Swaraj. But this text reads in the opposite direction, a look outward, as opposed to look inward into the self. And this text has a foreword by a noted American man of letters, a transcendentalist, and a sympathizer with Indian independence, and a scholar of English literature, Robert Morris Lovett, one of Dash's closest associates. And it begins with an assessment of the importance of India to the British Empire. He constantly mentions the US Constitution as, again, a model and the greatest document of the world, he says that, and as an inspiration to both Chinese and Indian nationalists. After his book, India in World Politics, came out, 1923, it was reissued many times, his citizenship was under scrutiny. The US government tried to revoke his citizenship and to expel him out of the country. And there were various reasons for this, which I can get into if there's interest. But somehow they couldn't find him. And he was enrolled as a PhD student at the School of Foreign Service in Georgetown, which is another mystery, eluding the agents on his tail. He escaped to Europe after his 1924 marriage and submitted the first thesis in international relations in 1925. He lived most of the interwar years in Germany and Italy and returned to the United States after World War II to die in New York in 1958. So, a few more things about Dash. He applied for US citizenship 3 times, and he received it his 3rd attempt. He was denied first in Oakland, California, and the clerk refused to accept the application. He wrote a letter saying that he had to be admitted because of his race being Caucasian. The Bureau declined and said that others had been declined, so he should be therefore declined. 1914, the context changed a little bit. He did not use the Caucasian justification. He used his good behavior and his commitment to the United States, and he got it in 1914. This was a part of another slice of world history, that is of the history of race and citizenship. In 1908, the number of East Indians entering the US totaled about 1,800, mostly from India. And at that time, Dash entered, he was working for the US Immigration and Naturalization Service in Vancouver. And he learned something that the United States referred to the 1911 Dictionary of Races in categorizing human populations. And they categorized people from India as Hindus. This is something that he came into contact with both through his work and through his life. This was, into official language, what was popularly referred to as Hindu, to refer to all from colonial India. So it was very possible, as many mentioned, that at that time, one could be a Muslim or a Sikh or a Christian Hindu coming to the US and therefore live in the United States. So I'll say a few more things about Dash and his legacies, and vis-a-vis world history and world literature. In 1935, along with his wife Mary, he established the Taraknath Dash Foundation in the United States of America, a charitable organization aimed to support Indian students studying in the US, just like he had been in 1908, 1909, and 10. The certificate of incorporation of that organization is right there. And the foundation moved from various locales in New York and DC before settling in Columbia University in the 1970s and from the 1980s, and it lasted until 2021. And it was led for most of its history by one scholar, Leonard Gordon, well known to the history of Bengal, professor of Indian history for most of his life at Brooklyn College, and the author of a book on Short and Subhash Bose. The foundation sponsored an annual lecture, the Taraknath Dash Award, and scholarships for Indian students. And 1 year before his death in 1958, Jadavpur University began the Taraknath Dash Center, which galvanized the first Department of International Relations in India. It began with the gift of his books that served as an index of his life, travels, and work. His books included 1,272 titles, and they are now all in the Central Library under the Taraknath Dash collection, covering a range of titles, including religion, including Vivekananda, Radhakrishnan, international politics, Indian economic history, etc. Many works of European history, European politics, Asian history, world politics. And from the early 1990s through the end of the organization's life in the United States, a fund was established by the US Foundation to send funds to India each year to support scholars to study different aspects of international relations as Tarak Dash saw it. And scholars came from as far afield as Sweden, Uganda, China. They researched topics like the G20, India-China relations, the creation of Bangladesh, Indian foreign policy, and one of the first centers in India to do so. From 2020, in the global pandemic, things began to change in the United States. Many urged for the foundation to be closed down as the funds from the United States were being scrutinized for various reasons. And as of 2021, the US Foundation closed and established a fellowship by the American Institute of Indian Studies in the name of Tarak Dash. And the initial goal was to start an organization to help Indian students studying in the US. And now that will be met through this fellowship, which will be awarded every year. It lasted from 1935 to 2021. Tarak Dash fits into various phases of world history and provides material for various approaches to world literature. At one level, he was an anti-colonial revolutionary of the early to mid-20th century who traveled across the world to further the cause of Indian independence, like many others. He also promoted a broader view of the world for Indians, as evidenced by his work in establishing the Tarak Dash Foundation. His life cannot be fully explained or captured by national or local historical frameworks. The United States of America is an important context for the development of figures like Dash, not only for the literal fact of doing his PhD at the Library of Congress in Georgetown, or studying at US universities like Norwich, Berkeley, Washington, but for his curious relationship to the idea of the United States as a model for democracy, which effectively erased any presence of the ongoing displacement and dispossession of indigenous peoples in the United States. It posed the image of the United States that the United States presented to the world. His life is also a part of a chapter in the scattered and multifaceted history of race and its relationship to law. Until 1952, when the year that the United States passed the Immigration and Nationality Act, which eliminated race as a category for a criteria of naturalization. That same year, Tarak Dash traveled to Calcutta to deliver a series of lectures where he was roundly castigated for his support for the United States of America and their foreign policy. He was one of the very few figures in the community of, quote, East Indians who shaped the changes in US immigration law vis-a-vis race, and was indelibly marked by this history in his own post-US travels and endeavors. The geographies of Dash and the spaces in which he lived do not conform to an easily understandable India any more than the United States of America was one bounded unit, was in flux and formation. His story is not representative of the majority of Indians of his time, of course, but it is illustrative of how significant parts of both Indian and American history are not complete without a consideration in the same framework. Not only because he traveled different parts of Japan, USA, Canada, Germany, and back to USA, back to India, but because he critiqued the world order as he saw it and sought to inculcate a vision of the world outside of familiar reference points. Writing his life constitutes an act of world history insofar as his life contributes to understanding larger scale changes from empires to nation states, capturing his perspectives and his efforts to widen the perspectives of Indian students constitutes an act of world making. It shows that the world was not divided into caricatures of colony and metropole only, but it included these spaces, like the borderland spaces of the United States of America and Canada, as key sites for the nurturing of a variant of Indian nationalism and reflected changes regarding citizenship and race. World history and world literature both present significant limits in the attempt to capture the local, the particular, and the vernacular. But as many contributors to the volume India After World History argue, some variant of world historical and world literary thought is necessary for understanding how people imagined the world outside the local, the particular, and the vernacular. And without such variants, we would not understand people like Dash and all those whose lives can never be contained in the narrative of one nation state. And given the continual revisioning of figures of our history, we would do well to remember that the perspective not of a particular nation or locality, but of the world itself, a totality, was on the minds of people like Dash. Identifying these perspectives, especially as much of the world looks more and more inward, will be the most important task facing world history and world literature of the future. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation, and which I'm sure would provoke a number of questions. I think Shukandada is here. Could I please request Shukandada to initiate discussion?
So I'd love to learn that. The questions to ask me.
Well, any other who would like to raise some questions? Well, let me then break the ice. Well, I was fascinated by the way you were looking at Taraknath Dash in the context of life history, in the context of what you call comparison literature globalization. Now, the standard format of Taraknath Dash, which you unfolded to us, is also pretty well known to us. I mean, if you look at any standard history textbook, we get it. Since you are emphasizing comparison, I was wondering if you'd like to compare the life story of similar Indian expatriates who worked for Indian independence, particularly female characters. I give you the examples of, for example, Madam Kama, Sarojini Naidu, Usha Mehta, and if you go to the other extent, the communist Suhasini Ali, who had all worked outside India for the Indian cause. As I see it, I might be totally wrong, the perceptions of Taraknath Dash, which you revealed through the analysis of the writings, could be very different if we take up the perceptions of these female expatriates working for India, either in America or in Paris or even in Germany. So I was wondering if you would be interested in such a comparison, which would certainly fit in with the broader problematic of comparison approaches to globalization. The other example let me cite, again a male expatriate Indian working for Indian independence, Rajani Pamtat. How would you compare his perceptions with Taraknath Dash's perceptions? And how would you again fit these comparisons within your broad framework of globalization? Those are the initial two questions that I had.
Thank you very much for those questions. They're things I have been thinking about, and I need to isolate where Dash fits as a unique figure, as I implied. He's not unique in many ways, but one part of him that I think is a relationship to these different models of inspiration and his peripatetic life that ended in the United States, and his turn, his changes in how he understood India while he was abroad, especially in the 1920s, his embrace of a Hindu identity, which also occurred. But from the vantage point of the United States, which I think sets him somewhat apart from some of the others, but I think it is a very good point that there are so many other figures, especially female figures, who fit this paradigm of what I would think of as one variant of India after world history. In terms of that, I think Dash is somebody who's open to a whole variety of sources, and that of course is too, but he has a different relationship to change and revolution, unlike Dash. It is both the travels and the models of inspiration that I see for Dash that make him into somewhat of a unique figure, but he must be placed in relation to the that you have mentioned. Thank you.
Well, if there are no other questions, can I go with it? Please,
As we were talking about Dr. Taraknath Dash, I'm basically interested in one of his contemporaries, that is Professor Shudendra Bose, and he was also working in the same paradigm, and they were actually reflecting the same sort of mindset, the same intellectuals. So how do you explain, so would you like to compare the perceptions of Das and Bose towards their preoccupation with national socialism or fascism, towards articulating the discursive grounds of internationalism at that point of time, and what were their experiences and what were the reflections on these ideologies? This would be my specific query to you.
please.
Yeah, thank you, Neilesh, for your talk. Could you please say a little bit more on the book, India's Position on World Politics, that you showed on the slides? I mean, if I'm not mistaken, is it written by Das himself? If so, then what is unique about that book? And talking about, I mean, as far as I could gather from the presentation, that you are linking the model and the ideas of Das to this whole concept of global history as distinct from world history. And how, although he advocated the cause of India in all his activities in terms of getting involved in associations and cause for the people living there, in which way do you, I mean, you said that he doesn't belong only to one particular nation at the end. He is of the world in that way, in terms of the totality. And that is how we make a departure from our existing models of world history. Now, connecting to the earlier idea of world literature as opposed to global literature, you mentioned Damrose, Casanova, Moretti, and others. And I'm sure that you know that Emily Apter has recently challenged this idea of world literature because it is not in that way global enough, representative enough. So are you hinting at this, that our models of history writing are at fault, and therefore that is also reflected to our representation of world literature? So I mean, in other words, how do you connect the story of Das to impinge on the current debates in world history, and what is unique about the book that I mentioned? Yeah, thank you.
And the one on the left.
Hello, sir. When we think about world history and world literature, we give special emphasis and we show special interest to specific parts of the world, especially European world and American world. Why it is that we do not show that much interest to Chinese history, Chinese culture, though it is our neighbor country and one of the biggest in size. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Bose, for your lecture. I really have two questions, and the first one has to do with the categories of the national and the anti-colonial. In much recent kind of history writing, there has been a tendency to posit these two categories as being mutually opposed. Manu Goswami, for instance, in a brilliant work on Binoy Kumar Sarkar, posits the national in opposition to the anti-colonial. The national as being more territorially grounded, whereas anti-colonial indicating a much more future-oriented schema on one hand, and also free from the territorial moorings of nationalism on the other. Chris Manjatra, on the other hand, in his intellectual biography of M.N. Roy, does not make this kind of a strict distinction between nationalism and anti-colonialism, but he talks about territorial and deterritorial forms of nationalist activism. This is one question, and the other one that I have has to do with world literature as a field and as a category. And Amir Mufti's recent work on world literature, Forget English, where he really traces the cultural mapping with which strategies of cultural mapping with which world literature operates back to kind of Orientalist practices and strategies. So how can we continue to use the category of world literature in productive ways by also undoing this kind of Orientalist cultural mapping that is embedded at its core?
Did you have another comment?
No, the other comparison is perhaps Dadabai knowledge.
Yeah.
Same thing, Dadabai knowledge. Didn't fundamentally question the British colonial rule. He wanted to have a good colonial government.
Right.
So that sort of things, if we can bring together those comparative frameworks, we think of not that time, I think it becomes much more interesting.
Yeah. Thank you for these questions. I will start with the first about Indian world politics, and then Dash impinging upon world and global. This was the question, I think. So I think you're right. As you pointed out, what he's doing is pointing us to global histories that aim at some kind of specificity. And then this addressed another question about the international entry into devotion, that how exposed figures like Dash were, and the fact that they did not question certain aspects of the internationalism of their time. And I think that would fit to Sridhar Bose also. So I'm not suggesting that he's critical of that, but that he is both a reflection of the internationalism of the time and of a certain kind of world making, because he cannot belong anywhere in particular. Bose, though, was much more, I think, grounded in the United States and had a certain relationship with the United States. And Dash did, but it was a bit more instrumental for him. About the book India and World Politics, it is noteworthy for a few reasons. He writes it from the Library of Congress when the United States is pursuing denaturalization, and he's trying to situate India in terms of its future independence. And this is one of the reasons why it is relevant and unique. Yet it does reflect the territorial idea of India at the time. And this gets to those two questions. Well, there's another question about world history and its focus on the West. And there has been many critical works that seek to displace the role of the West in conceptions of world history. And that was in the second phase of world history that I had mentioned. So that the first phase, which sought to inculcate peace after the wars, was focused primarily on the West. But from the second, there are interests in imagining a world history from multiple centers, one of which being China, and thinking about China not as only a history of China, but as a way of thinking about the world. That starts to emerge in that second phase of world history. And there are many other approaches to the world without the center in the West, which I also had mentioned in the final version of Global History, which seeks also to write about history without a presumption of the West at the center. Well, finally, about the national, the anti-colonial, the territorial, the deterritorial, and the concept of world literature. So this issue is actually discussed a bit the latter in the book, so if you are interested, I would encourage you to take a look at it. And it's addressed by Alex Beecroft, who takes on Mufti's critiques and accepts them, and says that there may be still value in trying to find other kinds of models for world literature outside of what he accepts to be an Orientalist inheritance. So there may be other ways of doing it, and Beecroft comes up with a variety of ecological reference points for imagining literature outside of what Mufti has pointed to. And there's a little debate in the book where some others don't accept that. So again, it's there if you are interested. And then you mentioned Manu Goswami and Krisman Japra. Just relevant to this point, in terms of internationalism, I would not place someone like Dash in the territorial and deterritorial relationship, but rather in the national, the anti-colonial. So following Goswami, the imagination of the future was very much present in most of Dash's life. And so there, I would say he fits from that perspective. From his national is anti-colonial in the way that you had mentioned, and however doesn't come from the usual starting points. So I would leave it at that and ask if there are any more questions.
Sure, please. Please.
Right. So thank you very much, Neilesh, for this fascinating talk. I was thinking as you were talking about Dash's conception of Hindu Bharatvarsha. So there has been a trajectory of thinking about Hindu Bharatvarsha across the 19th century. So Akhar Dutta says in Bharatvarshi Pashak Sambhata, E Hindu ki she Hindu. Then Buddha makes it more complicated with, on the one hand, writing his Achar Prabandha, on the other hand, writing something like Swapna Datta Bharatvarsha Itihas. And then Bankim. Now, when Taraknath Das by 1905, he's already left India. But there was a very categorical shift in the dynamic about Hindu-Muslim thinking after the Mongol War, more or less about that period of time. So, would you say that there was a continuation of this thought about Hindu Bharatvarsha, or was there a very different kind of narrative emerging out of this cosmopolitan movement across the globe about Hindu Bharatvarsha?
Yes, thank you for that question. I would say there is a continuity in terms of Dash's reference points, and his writings showcase his awareness of many of the figures you mentioned. But from the early 1910s, a big initiative of Dash and others that he is around is the acquisition of citizenship in the United States for Hindus. And this, of course, takes on its own historical trajectory. And the etymology of Hindu in that context has its own very particular history. They come together in the 1920s when he writes a very interesting letter to Lajpat Rai in 1926, and he says that in America and everywhere, this is a letter that he writes to him after so many things have happened in colonial India, Calcutta riots and other things, and he says that Hindus in America and everywhere have to be protected. And he includes both. He has a little section on Hindus in America, and he reflects this larger continuity of imagining India as Hindu. So that is the updated and, let's say, at least if not global, trans-regional aspect of history that is at play for Dash, which itself, by 1952, Indians are able to be naturalized. And he was a citizen, and even those like Bhagat Singh Thind, who had citizenship revoked, did get their citizenship later in the 1930s, and many others did. So, but that other history, I think, is often less visible to the histories that you have mentioned.
Any other question? I think those are books. Haraprasad also wrote a book, I think in 1909 or 1910, Struggles for Independence.
Yes, sir, my
He also wrote a book, I think, on 1909 or 1910, The Struggles for Independence. Do you find a difference in terms of approach to the notion of independence, to the notion of globalization in that particular age, in terms of solidarity across the countries, when you compare this particular book with Indian world politics?
Yes, there's a much more aggressive vision of the future of India, which is a territorial India, and so that vision had not been in place in the same way in his earlier book, and he is also informed by all of the political scientists he's reading from the United States, and he's also informed by international security when he gets to Indian world politics. That is a major change.
So the major change.
Yes.
You also wrote a book on the murder of Queen Victoria.
That's right.
How do you put that book in the broader perspective that you are presenting?
Well, he also has an imperial.
Yes, that's why I asked.
He also has an imperial side to him that doesn't go away throughout his entire life, and it's evidenced by various books, as Professor Das mentioned about Victoria, and he writes about the empire in many ways, in very positive ways, and so that aspect of him is also to be not forgotten. It is not as if that was not important to him.
But again, it becomes quite sympathetic to the Gadar movement.
Yeah, I mean, he's present at the beginning.
So that's
Yes.
what I'm saying. In Das, we find lot of conflicting
Yes.
identities. So we did not place a person like him within one
Right.
particular paradigm.
Yes.
And that perhaps needs to be taken care of, whether we call him, view him as a nationalist in territorial sense or non-territorial sense, or as a nationalist in terms of the broader notion of Hindu identity. So there are various different identities in that, and perhaps we need to understand why at a particular historical conjuncture, one form of identity gained precedence over the other.
Yes, I agree fully with that. Also to say that I'm not necessarily advocating for world history, but I'm saying that world history in its various attempts is trying to capture this aspect of human experience, that all of the various contradictions that do not necessarily add up to a coherent whole is what world history might look toward for a figure like Dash.
Any other question? Time is up. Is it? সুকান্তদা কিছু বলবেন? সুকান্তদা আপনি আছেন, কিছু বলবেন না, এটা হয় না।
খুবই ভয়, আমার এখানে কিছু বলার নেই রে ভাই। This is outside my study. Look, there are really nothing of any consequence to say, so why should I take up people's time? If there was, I would. It's a fascinating speech, but as I said, I come to learn. I've learned.
Well, in that, well then perhaps, I mean, could I on my own behalf and on behalf of the entire House, sincerely and warmly congratulate you for that excellent presentation. We are all looking forward to the publication of this work, which I'm sure would provide new entry points on writing and rewriting certain historical figures which could be compared to that of Haraprasad Bose. I have certain other questions on migration and communal violence, since I have also worked on that, but that we can reserve it for private address. Thank you very much indeed.
We thank Professor Neilesh Bose and Professor Suranjan Das for this lecture session, and thank everyone. We're sure that the conversation will continue. Thank you.